we are joined now by Anthony Lowenstein, best-selling author of the book The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. You also might know his book Disaster Capitalism from a few years ago. Anthony, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. So, this is not your first book about Israel either, right? Your book, My Israel Question, came out in 2006. What motivated you to approach this book and write about Israel again, but approaching it from this new angle of like Israel's integral role in the military industrial complex and the surveillance technology that it's kind of become quietly infamous for exporting?
I've been visiting Israel and Palestine for close to 20 years. I've been going every 3 or 4 years. I've been reporting from the West Bank or Gaza and Israel. And between 2016 and 2020, I was living in East Jerusalem for a number of years. And I think when I was there, although I'd been hearing about Pegasus, the infamous spyware that some viewers will know that you can basically hack people's phones, I was sort of starting to realize that having done a lot of reporting on other conflicts, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Honduras, those conflicts, as horrible as they are very geographically placed. They're in those countries, within those borders. But the occupation in Palestine actually is exported. It's now the weapons and the tools and technologies that Israel's using to maintain that occupation, 56 years and counting, since 1967, is a brutal occupation that requires huge numbers of intelligence gathering, spyware, smart walls. And I felt like there was a need to sort of do the bigger picture. As you said in your introduction, my work on disaster capitalism kind of gave a sense of people making money from misery, essentially. And the occupation of Palestine, which is now the longest occupation in modern times, is a massive money earner for Israel. And as someone who is Jewish, although secular and anti-Zionist, I thought it was important to not just look at it politically, but also question where the Jewish state, in my view, has gone so fundamentally wrong.
Well, I mean, that's an important thing to flesh out here, because so much of the portrayal of being anti-Zionist is, in at least here in the United States, it means that you're anti-Semitic or that you're anti-Jewish in some way. And I think we're becoming clearer-eyed in differentiating that, because as you write about, we'll get into the book in a sec, but I'm just curious, do you think it's reductive to call Israel a proxy for U.S. and Western imperialism in many ways? I mean, they've become their own entity in and of themselves, but I feel like that's a useful way for some people to understand the dynamic, at the outset at least.
I think Israel is a client state of the US, but it's also more than that. So yes, there's no doubt without the US support, and this doesn't really make much of a difference, to be honest, whether there's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican. I mean, in some ways with Trump, there was much more honesty about how the US viewed Israel. I mean, Biden's been in power now for 2 years. Nothing has changed. Nothing will change on this issue, sadly. There is a lot more discussion in the Democratic Party, to be sure. There's actually a kind of civil war of sorts over Israel-Palestine in the Democratic Party, to the point where this year, for the first time in a Pew poll, a majority of Democratic voters were more sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis. That's a shift. It's never happened before. So you don't see that represented by Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. They're very pro-Israel, whatever that means, which I would argue is actually anti-Israel, because it's not being critical about what Israel is doing with the occupation. But Israel also has its own identity, has its own, obviously, mission. And what you find in the last decades, as I show in the book, is that many times Israel is selling weapons and training and technology, even to countries that the US won't sell to. I mean, the US sells weapons to anyone. I mean, they are the world's biggest arms dealer by far. But Israel will basically, I think, take that to the next level. And while still claiming to be, a moral army, a moral country, a light unto the nations, an inspiration for not just Jews, but people around the world. And I think their actions, as I expose in the book, really make a mockery of that, frankly.
I mean, Israel, I didn't even realize at this point, 10th biggest arms dealer in the world, despite its really like relatively small population. So, I mean, I think that would come as a surprise for some people, but uh, and also given the fact that Israel insists that U.S. aid for its militarism is essential to maintaining the country's existence. But how did we get to this point where Israel has become such a dominant actor on the global stage in terms of arms sales and also surveillance technology?
I mean, the short answer is then with the occupation, the occupation, the occupation. Just like the US was testing weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11, such as the West is now testing weapons in Ukraine with the Russian invasion of their country. So, on one level, it's not hugely unusual for war zones to be testing zones for new sophisticated technology and spyware and surveillance tech. But the difference with Palestine is that Israel has in its backyard, essentially for half a century, an occupied population. So, to control that population, to manage them, to dominate them, you have to develop huge numbers of so-called counterinsurgency techniques, both human intelligence and obviously in the modern age, digital intelligence. And what I show in the book is that so many countries in the last 50 years, although it's accelerated since 9/11, have gone to Israel because they want those tools and technologies, but also those so-called tools of counterinsurgency. So we look at the dirty wars in Latin and South America in the 70s and 80s, where some regimes like Guatemala are committing actual genocide against their indigenous population. Israel's assisting, training, arming, helping out. Why? Because the Guatemalans at the time wanted those experiences. They saw what Israel was doing in Palestine, and they wanted to do the same thing in their own country. That's one example amongst so many. So what I guess has happened here over decades is that what Israel has done, it's testing huge number of weapons in Palestine itself. What I mean by that is drones, surveillance, in the modern age, facial recognition, biometric tools, all these sophisticated tools and technologies to control Palestinians. And then they sell them as battle tested. They actually say that, both as a government and Israeli companies, to huge numbers of countries around the world. And as I show in the book, we know of at least 130 countries, so the majority of nations in the world, in the last half century that have bought some form of Israeli surveillance. That's democracies and dictatorships. And often those nations, as an example, Saudi Arabia, a close Israeli ally, not an official friend, but certainly a close ally now, is desperate for Israeli spyware and defense tech. UAE, Bangladesh, I mean, literally you can list pretty much every repressive regime in the world. And of course, those countries use other countries' defense technology as well. It's not solely Israeli often. But what Israel has is, as I said, when you have an occupation and a occupied people in your backyard, you have an endless supply, an opportunity to test weapons and test tools. And post 9/11, that was on crack, because when the US launched its own war on terror after 9/11, it was basically the Israeli playbook, not just the actions, but the rhetoric. And I explain that a lot in the book. What I mean by that is that when America was claiming to fight terrorism and its collateral damage and all this language that's become so normal for us now in the West, Israel had been doing that for decades against Palestinians in Palestine or Palestinians in Lebanon when they were occupying from 1982. So in some ways, Israel wrote the playbook, and that playbook is very attractive to many, many nations that want to do something similar in their own backyard.
Well, I mean, not to put it too cynically, but it's like Israeli militants is vertically integrated, or that their technology is, because they're able to test these things in real time, which is
Absolutely.
kind of as disturbing as it gets. You spoke about Guatemala there, but some of the other revelations in your book are really important to flesh out historically just how Israel was working with these dictatorships or with death squads in Latin America in the 70s, selling weapons to Pinochet in Chile, and others. Talk a bit about that history, and how, like that very much laid the groundwork to make Israel kind of the weapons and technology behemoth that it is today.
Mm. I mean, there are so many examples, so let me give you a few. Rwanda, literally during the genocide in 1994, selling weapons to the Rwandan regime. In the more modern era, Myanmar, which in the last 5 or 6 years has also committed genocide against its Rohingya population. The UN found that a few years ago. Israel was providing technology, weapons, and spyware. As I said, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bangladesh, the Philippines during Duterte's, the former leader's term there, that was committing huge numbers of abuses against alleged drug users, 40,000 people killed. Israel was a key ally. And in some ways, as I said, one of the key relationships, which I talk about a lot in the book actually, is between Israel and apartheid South Africa. That regime ended in 1994, so it's history. But actually, it's incredibly relevant today because they didn't just have an alliance based on defense. They wanted to buy weapons from each other. South Africa was desperate for uranium, and thank Christ that never actually happened, because South African apartheid with a nuclear weapon is a pretty scary thought, as is Israel for that matter today.
Well, I mean, we can just look into the future and see that, right?
Exactly. And of course, Israel has 200 nuclear weapons as we speak, if not more.
Yeah.
But there was also an ideological alignment there. They both saw themselves on the front lines against barbarism. So obviously in Israel, it was against Palestinians. South Africa, it was against blacks. And you had Israeli leaders, including Ariel Sharon, a former Israeli prime minister, now dead, who went to South Africa back in the day during apartheid and deeply admired their so-called Bantustans, this idea of quasi-self-ruling black townships, which essentially is exactly what Israel is now doing in the West Bank. South African apartheid was a key model for Israel, and Ariel Sharon himself acknowledged that. He admitted that. His aides have acknowledged that. Now, the reason all that might seem like ancient history, but actually it's very relevant, because one part of the book I talk about is that Israel has become an inspiration, not just because of its defense, but also as an ethno-national state, that a nation that is a Jewish supremacist nation in the 21st century. And which nation particularly is inspired by that today? India. India is the world's biggest nation now, world's biggest population, surpassed China this year, world's biggest self-described democracy, although I'll question that.
Mm-hmm.
And what India is doing is not solely based on what Israel wants. Of course it's not. But it's relevant because Modi, the leader of India, is now very close to Netanyahu, the leader of Israel. They don't just share a defense relationship. They also share an ideology. In India, of course, it's Hindu fundamentalism. And let's be clear, the US and my country, Australia, is now cozying up to India because they're not China. China is the bad guy. India is the good guy. But India actually, under Modi, is looking in some places, and you have senior leaders of that regime calling for ethnic cleansing against Muslims. Indian officials openly, I talk about this in the book, openly admiring what Israel's doing in the West Bank and wanting to do similar things in Muslim areas of Kashmir. In other words, Israel is a model. Israel is becoming a model. And India, as I said, as the world's biggest democracy, if they see Israel as a model, we should be a little bit worried.
Certainly. I mean, and this is a deep ideology for Narendra Modi. He rose to power as a Hindu nationalist and in opposition to the Muslim minority. There's an ideological parallel with Israel, which is deeply troubling, and obviously I feel like those parallels are even starker too when you bring them domestically to the United States. I mean, you quote in your book Richard Spencer, the infamous white supremacist in the United States, basically praising Israel as a like a European settler colonial state, and the through line that I've got to say is just this deep hatred and fear of brown people and Muslims more broadly.
Absolutely. And I wanted to mention about the far right because for many viewers, they might think, why would you have a far right person who traditionally doesn't like Jews, could be a neo-Nazi? And when you go to these far right rallies, and I've been there for work purposes, that's the only reason I would go, they often wave the Israeli flag. People might think, sorry, what waving the Israeli flag? They don't like Jews. The issue is not Jews. They don't like Jews. What they do like is the concept of a, as you said, a European-style settler colonial state that proudly prioritizes Jews. Now, they, of course, want to create a Christian ethno-state in the US or parts of Europe or wherever it may be. So Richard Spencer, as you quote there, also called himself a white Zionist. And that really sums it up. Doesn't like Jews, doesn't want to be like Israel, but admires what Israel has done for Jews, what he wants to do, and many, many others for Christians in the US, as I said, or elsewhere. And what's so disturbing, and I say this as a human, but also as a Jew, is that Israel is developing relationships with the far right, not distancing themselves. I'm not talking about particularly Richard Spencer, but the idea of far-right regimes or parties around the world, in Europe and elsewhere, that Israel is developing relationships, wants to have those relationships, parties or groups that don't traditionally like Jews. And that endangers all of us, obviously non-Jews, but definitely Jews. And it's remarkable to me that, 75 years, a bit more than that now, after the end of Second World War and the Holocaust, and many Jews, including me, had many of our family members killed by the Nazis. Like, this is our legacy, our being Jew. Like this, I mean, I'm a non-religious Jew, but this is the legacy of the Jewish people, to have an Israel that proudly associates with anti-Semitic groups or regimes. That needs to be called out and challenged, because frankly, I know in the US particularly, there is still in some places an unease, right, about being too critical of Israel, even talking about Israel in a critical way, which is reflected, with some exceptions, in your Congress.
Yeah, with very few exceptions. And the ones that do speak out, like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, are essentially smeared as anti-Semitic.
Absolutely.
And in Ilhan Omar's case, stripped of her committee assignments when the Republicans take charge, or at least, yeah. I mean, the repercussions are dire, even though I think there is a good understanding among younger people that is a lot more aligned with what we're talking about, and just the reality of Israeli occupation. That's the glimmer of hope. But I wanted to ask if you could expand on some of the phone hacking technology that you touched on earlier, particularly Pegasus, which helped the Saudis hack Jamal Khashoggi's phone, and has been sold to other countries and regimes across the globe. And I also know that they had a different firm, I believe, an Israeli surveillance firm that sold to Putin, and that he's been using it against his opponents for a long period of time. But just what are these groups? What are these companies? What is their utility?
So yeah, Israel has become notoriously, as you said before, some of the most known, infamous spyware companies in the world. Pegasus is the most famous, by a company called NSO Group. And it's important for viewers to know that most of these defense companies, their genesis is from men and women who have come from the Israeli military, often the intelligence, the so-called Unit 8200, which is like the NSA, essentially, in the US. So they've spent years and years and years working and honing their skills and tools and technologies on Palestinians, which they then take to the private sector. Pegasus is infamous. As you said, it's been used by, we don't really know the number, but no doubt dozens and dozens and dozens. Saudi Arabia, Mexico, would you believe, is the biggest user of Pegasus in the world, not just in the past, but still today under its nominally left-wing government there. It's remarkable. Like, you see, countries become obsessed with this technology. You want to listen to your enemies, your dissidents, your human rights activists, your journalists, your political opponents. It's so easy, not that expensive for a state to buy. And there are lots of other companies that are existing. The one you mentioned with Putin is Celebrite, which is not as known, but is still just as effective. Again, developed by people who used to work in the Israeli intelligence services. Celebrite operates in basically virtually every US government department, would you believe? It's used by Putin's Russia, it's used by China in China, but also in Hong Kong, Belarus, lots and lots of regimes around the world, in Australia, my country. And its most known use is a police department wants to hack into a person's phone who's a suspect, and Celebrite allows them to, hack into an iPhone, essentially. And look, there are times, obviously, where an individual may be doing horrible things, alleged pedophilia, and frankly, I don't think by definition these tools are immoral. By definition, the problem is that all these tools and technologies bleed into various other parts of society. They don't stay where they're designed. NSO claims it's only used to go after terrorists and pedophiles. What's nonsense? It ends up being used by regime after regime after regime to go after their enemies. Like, this is how it works. And at the moment, there's no real regulation in anywhere in the world because no country wants to regulate it, right? Because every country wants access to this technology, including the US. A few years ago, the US administration, when Biden came in, put a censor on NSO Group, which on the face of it seemed great. They were said to be abusing human rights, and the US pledged to crack down on this. Well, two problems with that. One, the US government is still using it. Oops, so there's that problem. And secondly, I saw this very much, not so much that the US is against spyware. The US doesn't want its own industry to be challenged. This is the problem that more and more countries face, that Israeli spyware particularly is now some of the most dominant in the world. And the US wants to see itself as the self-described global hegemon as beyond reproach, right? So if any other country like Israel, even though Israel is a friend, nominally, and I say this in the book, right, that Israel and America have a weird relationship. They're close, they're intimate, they love each other, sort of. They also don't really trust each other. Every day, the NSA has roughly 400 Hebrew speakers spying on Israel. Every day. And I can assure you that works both ways. So they're friends, but they don't trust each other. This is how it works. And that's important for people to understand, because there's so much debate which you hear constantly in the US is Israel's our closest ally. We have shared values. I just heard it again this week. Sorry, what are these shared values? Shared values of what? Backing occupation or apartheid? Like, what is that shared value? I mean, that's what it is, right? But so spyware has become intimately connected to Israel's dominance in this industry around the world.
How much of it, too, is the fact that this spyware is so widely sold to a variety of different countries? How much of that is designed to prevent Israel from making themselves pariahs because they have their kind of finger in every pot, so to speak?
It's a big factor. Two reasons for that. One, I see so much of this technology being exported almost as an insurance policy, that Israel's aware that many countries don't like what it's doing in Palestine, but they believe, and history would suggest with some justification, that sure, a nation might put out a terse press release if there's more settlements in the West Bank, but they're desperate for Israeli technology, for spyware. So that's part of it. And I think also there's this idea somehow that Israel is, you sort of said before, not so much beyond reproach, but is able to, I mean, it's important viewers understand, these Israeli companies like NSO Group are only private in name only. They're essentially arms of the state. So when Netanyahu and the Mossad in the last 10 years has often gone to nations they want to befriend, Saudi, UAE, Rwanda, and I track this in the book, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months after Netanyahu visits country X or vice versa, they're using NSO Group's Pegasus. That's not accidental. That's how you make friends, right? I mean, they're transactional friendship. I don't think it's particularly, I wouldn't say as much love there, but there's a transactional nature to it, right? So And of course, because these companies are essentially arms of the state, Israel therefore has intelligence access to all the information that's coming in through these tools. So when they're selling it to India or Saudi or UAE or whoever it may be, Israel's listening. And the US, of course, listens to the NSA as well, right? But this is
Yeah.
how it works.
And this is my last question because I know we have to let you go. But I mean, like, we saw this report out of The Intercept a few weeks ago. I believe Ken Klippenstein broke it. How there was U.S. intelligence showing that Israel was considering bombing Iran, and that the United States didn't have a good handle on what those plans entailed. Thankfully, someone leaked this to Ken, so that does a good job of squashing it to a degree. But like, they're rogue at this point, and yet they have completely unconditional funding from my country, and it just how have you observed you've been a journalist and writer for many years now, this emboldening of Israel through their now lucrative technological firms and weapons industry, and the fact that there is seemingly no tangible recourse outside of criticism from lefties like myself for the apartheid and the occupation?
I mean, the one word is impunity. Israel has impunity to do what it wants. It has for decades. I mean, the sort of slight element of hope here, because I'd like to leave it with a bit of hope, is, as I said, public opinion actually is shifting. As I said before, Democratic voters, the majority now support Palestinians over Israel. In the Jewish community in America particularly, there is an absolutely, really, to me, necessary civil war going on. It's a non-violent civil war within the Jewish community. That is vital. It's mostly young versus old. It's a bit more complicated than that. But in short, younger Jews much more critical, older Jews much more supportive of Israel, pushing their community and their so-called leadership to not give carte blanche to Israel. And if that relationship breaks or is severed or is challenged, Israel has a problem. And of course, there's obviously a growing, I think, willingness and openness in the American media to have Palestinians on, to hear a Palestinian voice. Social media, which I talk about in the book, how it's often been censored by Israel and Israeli-affiliated organizations, is providing, despite all that censorship, still an unfiltered reality. You go onto people's, with Facebook, Twitter, whatever it may be, people can see the reality of occupation. You can't really control that. It is what it is. People can see it. And I think that does contribute to a growing shift in public opinion. Like with apartheid South Africa, without outside pressure, this won't change. Israeli Jews won't wake up one day and say, this occupation is pretty awful. Of course, there are Israeli Jews, some of them who oppose it. Obviously, there are. But they're very small. And in fact, the young Jewish population in Israel, in fact, are getting more right-wing, not more left-wing. So without outside pressure, which I think is slowly starting to happen, despite the massive, almost insurance policy over weapons, there is some hope. We have to have some hope.